Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I guess we'll get started. My name is Juan Fernandez. I am the coordinator at the Queer Resource Center at City College of San Francisco. I use he, him, and they pronouns. And I am also your moderator today, not the monitor. I am the moderator today for this session. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few items to share with you. My eyes are going to be over here because I'm reading a script. Please note that we are in a Zoom meeting and that you have full access to your video and audio and microphone capabilities. Please be mindful of the presenters and other attendees in this session and stay on mute or mute yourself when not actively asking a question or sharing when prompted by the presenters. Should you have questions or comments otherwise, please enter them into the chat box. As time allows, we will share your questions with the presenters and they may monitor as well. Additionally, you may use the chat feature to share thoughts with the presenters and with each other. The session listing in the conference app details the session and includes any documents provided by the presenter. The app also includes a short survey at the end of the listing. We ask that you complete the survey at the end of the session as it is important feedback for the planning purposes. Thank you for being with us and enjoy the session. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Tim Gutierrez, Assistant Professor, Deborah Brown, Assistant Professor of History and Ethnic Studies, Professor Brian Keene, Professor Wendy Silva, and Professor Robert Heyer. And everyone is here representing Riverside City College, which is very exciting. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan, for that intro. So we're gonna, excuse me, my name is Robert Hires, he, him pronouns. We're gonna get started with the presentation. All right, so our presentation title, Chosen Family, Understanding the Chosen Kin Community as a Model for Liberation. All right, and we're gonna get started here with Dr. Gutierrez.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Gutierrez, he, him. I teach sociology. And I wanted to start just by pointing out the old news that the nuclear family is in crisis. It's also important to remember that it's the nuclear family in crisis, not the concept of family entirely. So the nuclear family is that restrictive family model that consists of two differently gendered adults in a fertile monogamous relationship, living together and raising their biological children. So in other words, a monogamous heterosexual couple and their offspring living together. And that nuclear family vision was constructed to fit the needs of a capitalist, heteronormative, patriarchal, and white supremacist society. It was built in the 19th and 20th century for an industrialized capitalist system. One person stays at home to do the unpaid labor so the other can work as many paid hours as possible. In sociology, we call this the breadwinner homemaker model. It's patriarchal because women are expected to stay home, work for free, and be economically dependent on men. It naturalizes a version of femininity as fixed and satisfied with this nurturing role, and a version of masculinity that is fixed and that rejects care work in favor of taking care of business. It's heteronormative because it naturalizes that differently gendered division of labor, plus other pillars of heterosexuality like monogamy and separation of friendship and romantic relationships. It's part of white supremacy because it centers a family structure that's most common in white families and stigmatizes other types of families, whether they be extended or dispersed or single parent households or matriarchal structures, etc., that are more common in BIPOC and immigrant communities. These traditions have deep cultural and emotional significance, but are too often viewed as pathological because they deviate from this nuclear model. So as we can see from that leaked Roe v. Wade decision, like they're coming for all of our rights. They're trying to force everybody back into a heteronormative patriarchal box. But the model they're trying to force us all into has been unraveling for decades. Even straight people are bailing on it. Next slide, please, Rob. So across sexualities and gender identities, people are increasingly seeking relationships of love and intimacy and care that exist beyond these heteronormative family structures. This is what Judith Stacy and others have called queering the family. So this nuclear family model is not able to meet people's economic, cultural, or emotional needs. It was never intended to. Capitalism has turned that breadwinner homemaker model into the dual earner model. All adults work outside the home to pay the rent, buy groceries. Women are expected to work the second shift for free, cooking and cleaning, bathing kids, etc. And you're expected to pay for childcare because you're gone all the time. Notice how much easier some of this care work would be with expanded family structures outside of this box. When there's less meaningful time together, people in family units have weaker bonds and get less emotional support. We're also less likely to feel fulfilled in our cultural needs because the need to hustle to survive alienates us from our communities and other nurturing spaces. So we call it queering the family, but even cis-het people have been jumping ship and seeking relationships of love and care and intimacy that exist beyond heteronormative family structures. These living and loving relationships are diverse and fluid and constantly being chosen and rechosen. So as heteronormative coupling and reproduction are decentered, friendship networks and other forms of intimacy become more important in our everyday lives. And that fuels further questioning and reevaluation of the significance and investment that we place into romantic coupling. Queer and trans and even cis-het people are increasingly seeking, and as Weeks writes, experiencing love as contingent and confluent, and seeking to live sexual relationships in terms of a friendship ethic. So in other words, people want to choose their families. Next slide, please. And that takes us to the core concept. When people exit or deprioritize family units that are based off of biological or legal ties, they build and seek comfort in chosen families, and the main focus of our presentation. So this is a term that's used in queer and trans communities to describe the diverse range of family groups that are constructed by choice rather than through biological or legal ties that provide intimacy, care, support, and mutual aid. These chosen families are one form of emotional and cultural nourishment among many. So to borrow a metaphor from the feminist economists J.K. Gibson Graham, they exist within a sustainably diverse ecology of relationships and family forms. They can supplement strong bonds with parents, siblings, and others, or they can make up for any potential lack of support. So as queer and trans structures, chosen families also work to challenge white supremacy and the capitalist cis-het patriarchy by embracing the variety of relationships and kinship structures that can serve our needs for intimacy and care. Living well is about more than our material needs. We have social, emotional, and communal needs as well. Chosen families encourage us to think expansively about the types of spaces where these needs can be met through movements, in the arts, in educational spaces, and these are the types of things that my amazing colleagues are going to be discussing next.
All right, so thank you, Tim. So basically, what I want to talk about a little bit was, so what do I mean by liberation? So liberation gets used sort of like thrown around a bit, and you know, it can mean different things to different people. And one of the things that I want to talk about is sort of like how we, especially in higher ed, sort of help reproduce the things that Tim just talked about, and sort of question that. So, so the first thing that we have to do is define the word liberation, because you know, if we let other people define it, then it's going to be defined to reproduce the things that Tim just talked about. So liberation here, to me, means that we're all working collectively. This is both professors and students and administrators, everyone within higher ed, to guarantee us all housing as a right, food as a right, movement as a right, universal health care, and universal child and elder care, all right? And one of the reasons that in the description here, it talks about the description of our talk, it talks about the idea that our queer and trans students hold the key to this, right, is because they're already doing, right, this work. They've essentially changed the social relations, right, the relationships between people that reproduce that sort of toxic, limiting, heteronormative family that really is just to reproduce capitalism. They're doing it already, right? So they hold the keys to their own liberation. And, you know, for thinking about sort of liberation also, and, you know, I'm going to talk about this in the next slide also, you know, liberation is not sort of like a charity, right? You know, basically my liberation as a professor is actually wrapped up in my students' liberation as a student, right? And my students' liberation is wrapped up in my liberation, right? This isn't sort of like a top-down sort of charity thing that I'm doing for my working class students, right? We are in this together, and our liberation is wrapped up in each other's liberation, right? There is no liberation for one until there's liberation for all, right? So the next thing I want to talk about here is sort of focus on higher ed. And I'm going to change the subject a little bit, not really, and then go back to, but anyway, so if we think about what is higher education's role in liberation, right? So for the most part, our role is to stop it, all right? Education in general is used within capitalism to reproduce the social relations that are necessary for capitalism to keep going, right? So essentially, and when I'm talking about capitalism, basically what I mean is that you have a large working class who works and basically is trying their best to get by. It's very hard for them to get by. All of the resources that they produce, right, get pulled up into what's called the bourgeoisie, which is sort of a minority of people, basically the people who own you know, what Marx called the means of production, right? So Bezos and, you know, all of those, right? I always go back to Jeff Bezos because here in the Inland Empire, you know, he's the main employer here. So for the most part, higher education is used to reproduce capitalism. However, if we think about especially stuff that's been going on lately, right? Education is not sort of this top-down thing. It's actually this space that where capitalism can be challenged, right? And if we think about some of the stuff that's going on in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill, they have some sort of like no woke bill or something like that. You know, and then and that's Republican, but even in Democratic states, the way that California disciplines the community college is through the purse strings, right? So what are we going to sort of pay you for, right? And we're going to look at things like, you know, how many of your students not only graduated but transferred. What are your students, you know, students that went to your university or your college, you know, what are they making 5 or 10 years down the road? Are they making more money than they made before they came in, right? We're going to take all of those things into consideration when we're deciding your funding, right? So education is not sort of this thing where it's automatically reproduced. We have to be disciplined and regulated in different ways. So with that being said, there's then space, right, for radical educators to sort of move in the other direction, right? And so one exception here was Paulo Freire, and I apologize, I always mispronounce his name. He was a radical educator who believed that education could lead to socialist revolution. He wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed and lots of other books. So Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's one of the most read teacher handbook texts for professors. And basically any students watching this, if you do a lot of group work in your class and you're like, why do we have to do group work again? Oh my God, right? You can thank this guy, all right? And basically what he believed in what he called dialogical relations, which basically was the idea that if teachers and students are talking in groups about problems, right, you could work through the problems and move towards more socialist solutions to those problems and essentially use education to, at one point, overthrow capitalism. His work is not actually used for that. If we think about sort of his work today, for the most part, it's used to reproduce capitalism rather than foster socialist revolution. And basically if we think about it, so we put you in group work, right? I'm talking to the students now. We put you in group work as students, right? Not to think through, how to use the keys you already have to, produce, universal housing or anything like that, right? We put you in groups to work through whatever you need to work through in the class to get you the grade that you need, to get you the degree that you need, to then essentially break off as individuals again onto the labor market and compete with each other for a decreasing amount of jobs, right? As capitalism matures, you get less and less, there's less and less work, all right? So, so we essentially reproduce it, right? And so, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because as educators, I'm talking to educators, we have to decide which direction we're going to go. And when our queer and trans students come in holding these keys, right? What are we going to do? Are we going to actually work with them towards their liberation? Or are we going to, sort of the way that we've done with Freire's work, reroute these impulses to then reproduce capitalism, right? And then I'm going to introduce the next presenter here, which Dr.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Tim. Buen dia a todos. I'm Brian Keane. My pronouns are he, él, they, ella. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Before going into anything, Rob, I'll have a series of sort of animations that will come up. I'll cue in a moment, but could we just get a sign with the various emojis? How many students do we have in this space today? Because we're gradually moving into a conversation that I hope will engage students as much as our faculty, classified professionals, and others. So with emojis, can I see that we have any students in the space? Yes, several are popping up. Great. Awesome. Thank you all for being here, because of course part of our goal in organizing was to think about ways that you already bring the keys for the liberation, for your own liberation in these classrooms. If we could move one forward, and actually two forward, Rob, that would be great. It'll bring up the quote and the identifier. If I had to ask you to name a queer individual from the past, you could no doubt identify people from the 20th century. If I ask you to think beyond the 20th century to the very distant past, indeed to the origins of human existence on this planet, it might be more challenging. I wanted to begin with a quote from Carolyn Dinshaw, who's a queer theorist and a medievalist, a field of study that is near and dear to my heart, that represents a period between Rome and the Renaissance, a period that is getting a lot of reimagining today. She says that we can forge dynamic relations to the past, even the distant or unfamiliar past, even if at present we do not know where such relations will lead. Using ideas of the past, creating relations with the past, touching in this way the past in our efforts to build selves and communities now and into the future. For many of us, we first learn about our sexuality, our gender identity, through images, through stories about other people. Sometimes, if we're fortunate, these stories have been passed down to us by members of our community, members of our family, but far too often we find ourselves hiding in libraries or in bookstores or gas stations or online apps and various platforms to find information that might help us figure out who we are, to come to terms with our identities, and to give us language to know how to describe who we are. Carolyn Dinshaw's model is that by knowing about the pasts of many people across the planet, we can form communities that help us better understand who we are and to build those communities now and into the future. As an art historian and museum professional, I think often about how still we have to work against the kind of hetero-cis models that have been described by my colleagues and that we'll continue to discuss, to resist narratives that still too often marginalize a majority of our population. That is to say that there are vast histories of queer and trans presence back to the beginning of life on this planet. Anthropology knows this, history of science knows this, various humanistic disciplines know this. Any history or coursework in our classrooms that does not acknowledge our presence in the past is anachronistic and harmful. If we can get the next two animations, Rob. When I visited the History Museum in Stockholm, the director proclaimed with a full-throated statement that if you don't know you have a past, it can be hard to imagine a future. So moving to the next slide, what does all of this have to do with chosen families, with our kinship groups? One of the models that comes up in studies about queer communities, trans communities, and our chosen families is the idea of generational memory. And for the next animation, Rob. Part of what we're contending with as a community is a lost generation. Some of this lost generation is an entire history of our race, of our gender identity, expression, or sexuality. In other instances, it is the very literal generation of men, women, intersex individuals, queer and trans people, especially communities of color, indigenous groups around the world that were lost during the outbreak and continued suffering and struggles with HIV and AIDS, even into the present. That sense of loss brings with it trauma, feelings of grief, feelings of guilt, but also in some cases, feelings of joy for survival. A model for chosen family is to remember all of our ancestors, however we identify, and finding out who those ancestors are and telling their stories. For the next one, then, Rob, we can borrow from an indigenous way of knowing and a model of storytelling. It's important as much to live within the moment, to remember those individuals by name, by experience, by identity, and so forth, and to pass those stories on, to bring them into the present, to not forget. Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck says, we have to as much remember the damage that has been done historically, remembering instances of prejudice and persecution of the past that is as much at play in the present. But we also have to not forget to celebrate moments of desire, of joy, of ecstasy, of orgasm, to remember that we as queer and trans people are sentient beings that feel as much the pain and the pleasure as all those around us. And so for the next one, looking at artist communities, we learn a number of models already that take place in our college settings. We have mentorship models, we have apprenticeship models in the arts that can be brought forward in queer and trans spaces, so that we create the storytelling mechanisms that we wish to bring forward. We have to create radical spaces on our campuses to disrupt normative identities and spaces, to be present in meetings where we might not otherwise have been given space or voice. A lot of that work falls to us as educators, as classified professionals, those that have any ounce of privilege or space to be able to bring forward our stories, realizing that this might, in some instances, mean that we put ourselves out there. As an untenured faculty member, I'm still grappling with how to do this in an effective way, and I'm glad that I see this is being recorded, but I've stated my concerns here. A few of the works that are on screen are by David Wojnarowicz, to upper left, who declares his concern that this boy that you see before you should have died. This boy should have died of many things, of bullying, of family abuse, of trauma, of drug use, but he did not die of AIDS. Jeff Gibson, the Choctaw Indigenous artist in lower left, creates a beadwork collage that says, that talks about the chosen family, that we choose our communities. And then our communities of color, those that were working with Andy Warhol in the spaces that he created, and then Black artists Ajamu and Sir Rodney have spoken about this long history of trauma that must be remembered, but not forgetting the desires and the goals of communities who continue to live and bring forward the memories, that even though our communities have experienced loss by death, they are not gone. For the next and final slide then, Rob, in my last 2 minutes, I wanted to make an additional statement about ways that we can move forward using the collective and activist model. So for the next animation, thank you. Activist work is multi-generational. This is something we know. We have to acknowledge, and we have to realize that some of this work might be slow, but the slowness is often baked into the institution. Whenever I hear that the process is going to be long and slow, I push back and ask why. What are we doing to make this process long and slow? How can we act more quickly because of the urgency of the lives that are at stake, especially our queer and trans colleagues, especially communities of color? For the next one then, Rob. We also have models in our classrooms and our campuses that follow the community of practice, where we're in constant dialogue, constantly checking ourselves to make sure we're up to date on current thinking, being in brave spaces to have challenging and critical conversations. We see the artist workshop model as another one. With each image that is on screen, these are communities that have questioned the institution, that push back especially against funding structures, political regimes that are in power that need to be questioned and need to be quickly taken down. The point that we've already heard, they've been coming for us and they will come for us, and we can stand together, united to push back. And for the final point, there are spaces like museums that are responding to the now. Social media has been a great platform to reveal the inequities in our institutions, and I would encourage all of us in our capacity as educators and students to use those same mechanisms that we see in activist communities to call into conversation our leaders, and after calling them into conversation, we may need to engage in some calling out for our own continued liberation. And with that, I introduce Professor Deborah Brown. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brian and Rob and Tim. This has been wonderful. My name is Dee Brown. My pronouns are she and they. And we're going to sort of go on a slightly different tack and discuss some of the realities in campus space, what this actually looks like when we use some of the theory and some of this radical liberatory thought that has been discussed to really bring that activism into our own spaces and build larger networks, right? And so I wanted to start with an idea that really stems from a creative collective in New York that actually holds a Kinfolk festival every year. And they created a definition, which I think is really helpful as a starting point to really bring in this idea of kinfolk and really also bring in folks of color into this conversation. So kinfolk, the idea is that it's a collective, a squad, a crew, a team, a fam, a chosen family, a kindred group, beloved folks, us, they, and really it ties in my mind together as an idea that queer family is not rooted only in those that are related by blood, but it's this chosen family group. And that we give each other the strength to be our truest, unapologetic selves. We give ourselves the strength to bring and bond together in that space. And when the rest of the world doesn't want us, when we have been sent out of our own families or not accepted as who we are as our truest selves in our own family groups, that there is a space for us and there's a network for us with these folks, right? With our kin folks. It's the people who see us for who we are and aren't afraid to love us in that space. And this loving network really makes us kinfolk, right? This idea that we're doing that work. And for me, you know, I'll bring in something a little bit personal. For me, I found that space when I was coming out, when my dad said that, you know, mentioned Bible scriptures and said I was going against everything that I you know, learned. My mom walked away from me and my siblings stopped talking to me once I had a partner that was a woman. And so I relied very heavily on my chosen family network, on my kinfolk when I was having a hard day, when I needed something, when they needed something, I would just be a listening ear or try to help them. Times when they would sleep on my couch, somebody needed something. And that is really, that personal experience is what drives my work in community and in the classroom and on campus, right? And hopefully that's something that will bring, even if that's not your experience and your struggle, that some of those ideas can be utilized to take the theories and move them into praxis or practice, right? How do we start building these communities and community programming to support the building of kinfolk networks? My beginning actually started not very far from where Juan is. I started as an adjunct lecturer at San Francisco State University in history, women and gender studies, and sexuality studies. And I taught the Intro to Queer Studies class. I taught the Intro to Sexuality Studies class. And strangely enough, when I started working there in 2010, there was no center, there was no Lavender graduation, and there was really no infrastructure for LGBTQIA2+ students. And most people were like, well, you're in San Francisco, just go to the Castro, go figure it out. And I was like, this is not enough, right? We need to do work that might be happening in community spaces on campus, right? How do we start doing that work here? And I was lucky enough because I was teaching these classes, right? And again, building curriculum helps to find students, right? If there is a queer class, I guarantee you LGBTQIA2+ students will find it and will want to take it. And it's a great way to start building that community within that space, okay? And students just started kind of coming to my office and hanging out, right? And they would go through their process and they would find each other in these spaces. So actually, Rob, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. And so, yeah, again, with the idea of how do we build these chosen family spaces on campus, the first thing was to build intentional spaces. And so for me, that first intentional space while I was a lecturer at San Francisco State was in my office, right? If you needed to come because you were having a rough day, like there would be space you could pull up, open a book and sit on my floor, right? And eventually, right, we want to get to a place where we have intentional spaces on campus, where beyond just, right, as Bambi mentioned, as many of us have heard, 10 spaces, 10 center spaces on campus is not enough. But even if you are not in a space where you have a center space, you might already have folks that are doing some of this kinship building in student clubs or in some classes that might focus on gender and sexuality. Those are great starting spaces, right? Things that you can do as a community member, whether it's classified professionals or faculty or students, right? Is say, we want to set up an hour or 2 hours a week of space that's just for us. That we have a specific space that isn't even concerned about what the allies are doing, what everyone else is doing, that it is a space where we can talk about our existence and the realities, right, of what we've gone through, right? And I think that space idea is tremendously important. One of the things you see actually in this festival is that we created a space where we say it's okay to not allow people in because we're not here to do work to take care of you. This is a space that's for us. And we are desperately in need of a space where we feel safe, or at least safer, with folks that are also in the struggle, right? And in terms of programming, right, if you can't do something like an intentional space every week or once a month, which is, again, one of those community ideas that you can utilize, also programming ideas at times when it's very, very difficult for our queer, trans, and gender non-binary students around big holidays, right? Around breaks in the semester, where you can actually plan something. What we used to do when I was at San Francisco State is we would have folks over for an unthanksgiving dinner. And just, again, to have the ritual and have people have a place to go on a day when it could be very difficult, right? Because you might not be connected or even allowed or even have any ties to a blood family. So, or a Kwanzaa Christmaka event, right? Something around kinfolk lunches and dinners. I always think breaking bread is important, maybe because I like food too much, but but the idea that you can actually bring in like food and eating and have folks do some of that, and also have things like healings, right? Like that you're going to sit and maybe somebody really is into crystals, maybe somebody has some other healing, chants, yoga, whatever it is, but ways that you can say, we're going to build community in a space that's focused on healing because we know we're dealing with trauma, right? So that idea. And then the last slide, the last two slides. And a quick note about queer and trans folks of color. I did want to mention, I think it's tremendously important, 70% of LGBTQIA2+ students in the CCC are BIPOC. It's something that was mentioned to us by Chancellor Ortiz Oakley in 2019, and I assume those numbers are still true. And I think that, again, a mission should also be to center and exalt the experiences of queer and trans folks of color within these spaces. And that includes, again, doing things like heal-ins, bringing things that are specific to the culture, and allowing space for QTPOC to have their own space and time, right? I know some campuses, they have QTPOC groups, meeting times that are really only for those folks, and put up signs that say, it's okay that this space is only for these folks. Right? Again, the idea about being unapologetic. I don't need to apologize for not letting some folks in, because there's an active process where you have to deal with heteronormativity and racism and sexism and whatever else goes on, right? Within that space where you're having to do a lot of work to manage folks that aren't part of that struggle. And so creating a space is also important for building kinfolk on your campus environment. So if you could go to the last slide. And it really reiterates the idea, why do we need these spaces? Why do we need our own spaces? Because we want folks to gather. We want folks to feel free away from those mainstream stereotypes, marginalizations that we've heard about already today, so that they can occupy a space that is for themselves. And even if you have center spaces, take some time and say, this chunk of time is going to be for these folks. So if they want to come into this space and have a meeting or do something, I imagine you will see students that want to come into that space. I know we've had a number of students, primarily, I would say, students of color that are showing up in our center space. But again, in integrated spaces, you were consistently dealing with patterns of heteronormativity, gender binarism, and white dominance that you were actively engaged in trying to manage, right? In a space that is specific for QTPOC, you are building a network and a community that is on a common ground where you're not having to deal with that, okay? So, sorry. And so just having some of the events that are there, I think is really important. Really important for creating an important, sort of foundation for kinfolk networks. So that was my piece. And I will now give the floor to Wendy Silva.
Thanks, Dee. Y'all can mark off your bingo sheet, the background noise, right? You're good, Dee, you're good. So my name is Wendy Silva. I'm an English professor at RCC. My pronouns are she or they. And so I kind of want to start by just talking about that statistic that Dee just mentioned, about 70% of our LGBTQ plus students are students of color. And so at RCC, about a little bit over 62% of our students are actually Latinx or Latina students. And so this is really important to this conversation because it gives us some cultural insights into how the majority of our students are understanding the concept of family, right? Outside of the nuclear family that Tim talked about at the beginning. And so whether you know this or not, the majority of Latinx cultures really center family, right? Family is family, period, no matter what. And so sometimes students are living in these toxic kind of family home situations and where they don't feel they can get any reprieve from because family is family, right? We don't step outside of that. And so in order to be culturally responsive to our students, we don't want to decenter the idea of family that is so highly valued in our culture, but instead we want to be able to shift that model to help them understand that family doesn't just have to be those biological and legal ties that Tim had mentioned earlier. And really, Latina families have been veering away from these traditional models, this nuclear structure for quite some time, especially in the immigrant and economically disadvantaged Latina populations, from which many of our students come from. Our grandparents live with us, our tios and tias are living with us, we have primos, cousins living with us, we have multiple families living in one home, single parent homes, right? So all of these different iterations of what a family can look like. So how can we bring this knowledge about our population at RCC or at your own schools to really value and be culturally responsive in our classrooms? And so I want to talk a little bit about my Puente class. So I'm the Puente English co-coordinator at RCC right now. And for those of you that don't know, Puente is a program that is Latina focused that really focuses students on transferring. We really want to get as many students to transfer to a four-year university as possible. And it's kind of like a learning community model. There's a lot of different elements, but predominantly it's a learning community model. They take the same English 1A class with the same group of students and the same instructor, and then they take English 1B, and there's some guidance courses that are paired with that as well. So in this Puente class, at the very beginning in the fall, students get assigned a familia. So it's a group of like 4 to 6 students who are going to be those students' familia, their family, for the entirety of the year. And so these groups are really meant to be support for these students as they struggle not only with the culture shock of navigating higher ed and everything that higher ed is, but just their overall success in college, right? And these familias do this by, first off, decentering whiteness. So we really kind of talk about the collective nature of family and how these students are going to really depend on each other for their success, that they're going to work together to be successful together, right? There's not, we're pushing away from the competition and you all are trying to, who can get the better grade or what did you get on your paper? It's like, how can we all be successful in this class together? And it really helps them navigate higher education. So they get to learn about resources together. I heard just the other day, students are like, oh, what are you gonna do after class? Oh, I'm going to La Casa to study. Do you wanna come? And they're like, yeah, I'll go with you, right? I hear students telling each other about the Promise program or other financial aid opportunities that they maybe didn't know about, right? They provide emotional support. So if they're dealing with breakups or stuff going on in their homes, dealing with things that a lot of Latino families deal with, they can relate to one another. They can depend on each other for that emotional support. They provide each other academic support. They get to do like extra peer reviews. I know students that are texting each other like, hey, how does my thesis statement look? This is totally outside of class, right? They're just getting feedback from each other. Like, did I do my citation right? What was the website that Professor Wendy said in class that we should use to check our citations, right? So they have this extra resource with each other. I actually even had a student in the fall who came to me and said, hey, I have 2 members in my familia who are really struggling with this first essay, but they're really embarrassed to talk to you. And so I was able to go and reach out to those students because a member of their familia told me they were struggling. Had he not done that, I wouldn't have known, right? Until after they submitted their paper, right? And then they would have started to fall behind. So it's really helpful in those regards, filling in some of those gaps. And of course, ultimately, they build really strong friendships. And at first, students are a little bit reticent to be as open with this new group of people that they just met, right? But they learn really quickly the value of having this really strong support network. Anytime a student is absent, we say, hey, you can come to office hours to ask questions, but check in with your familia. And so students are like taking pictures of all the PowerPoint slides and they're getting them on Zoom so they can hear certain discussions, and the students themselves are doing that, right? Which takes actually a lot off my shoulders because students are depending not solely on me as the instructor, but we're distributing that power dynamic amongst ourselves and really kind of helping each other be successful. And they're helping me be successful as an instructor too, right? So it's that give and take. And so they really tend to depend on each other in these small familias as part of that larger familia structure in our classroom. So my co-coordinator and I, we tell students from the day one that we are their family and we're going to be there for them, and then we do it, right? And so our roles go far beyond just teachers of a specific subject. We check in on our students' mental health. We check in on what they're struggling with at home. We're checking and see how they're doing in their other classes, any challenges that they're facing. And this model really works towards that liberation that Rob was talking about, because it centers our students' cultural experiences and it values them in spaces that hasn't traditionally valued them. It lets them know that they're welcome as they are, and that they do not have to let go of these different elements of their culture just because they're in this new space, right? And when students feel comfortable and welcome, we know that that's the perfect recipe for learning, right? Rob, next slide, please. Gracias. And so I wanted to share some student voices here at the end, just kind of some voices of students who thought that the idea of familias in the class has been particularly beneficial to them and why. So I'll share, I don't know if you all on your screen, mine's like blacking out parts at the top. So I'm going to read the second and the third, the yellow and the orange ones, just to kind of bring our attention to some student voices. So one student said, my familia has helped me grow as a person. I only ever had 2 best friends, but when I got my second familia, I felt so much support. They helped me talk in front of the class, even though I was so scared to, which has helped in my success to feel more confident to speak more. So this student is obviously highlighting the fact that their familia helped them get more confident to speak, not only in our class, but in other classes, feel confident that what they have to say matters at all, right? That is huge. That's far beyond what, far more important to me than a student learning about topic sentences, right? This is really validating to their person, to their humanity. And then the orange one, a student said, during this semester, my familia helped me a lot with staying up to date on assignments. They would ask if we have assignments, if we've done assignments, it would remind me to do it, as well as introducing me to other classmates, which I now have a good friendship with. We have a bond growing out of the classroom. Since I'm not the most social person, I often will not talk to people, But with them, it's been great having that friendship. So again, feeling comfortable in the class to actually form these connections. Stepping out of the comfort zone, that green one, the student was saying how important it was that they stepped out of their comfort zone with their familia. At the bottom, you know, feeling like they're not alone, feeling like the stresses that they're experiencing as a Latina student, their familia members are also experiencing, right? And so even though this information I'm sharing with you is from my Puente class, again, 70% of our LGBT students on campus are students of color. And since we have a majority Latina students, we have a lot of those students in our Puente class, right? And so by using familias, we're helping all students understand that a family unit can and is who we choose to surround ourselves with, right? And I've only been doing this model for 1 year, but I hope to start implementing it in all of my composition classes, and especially, and it more intentionally, in our Rainbow Learning community that we're going to be launching at RCC this fall. It's going to be a learning community that is based off of the Umoja and the Puente models. We're kind of starting with just the learning community piece and then hopefully scaling up as we go. But this chosen family piece is going to be very instrumental to our LGBT students. I'm hoping to do a unit on chosen families and really kind of use that Puente Familia model in this new Rainbow Learning community model. That's going to be open to, it's going to be open to everyone, but it will focus specifically on making the curriculum LGBT focused, and it will be hopefully filled mostly with LGBT plus students and allies. That's our goal, at least. Yeah. Last slide, I think. Do we have a last slide? The empty slide. So thank you all of you for coming. We just wanted to open it up now for some questions or conversation, dialogue. I know we covered a lot of things very quickly, but if anyone has anything to share or wants to type in the chat, I know Juan, you're gonna moderate for us. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you all for that. That was a lot to kind of process and unpack, but it's really important work. I myself have also done work in with the concepts of chosen family and chosen familia. So I really appreciate that. And I myself am trying to kind of unpack, because I feel like I went on a total voyage of theory and language. But if anything, I just really appreciate how y'all have been able to break down something that is so kind of abstract within queer culture. Because at times we don't even know that we're participating in queer family, right? Or with kinfolk, right? Like we just kind of exist within our circles, and that's how we survive, right? And so I think providing access to a language and a framework is really important, especially for educators and students that are interested in kind of that type of community building. So I want to go ahead and open up the chat for some questions. Also, if I do want to be mindful and let y'all know that we have about 8 minutes for the Q&A before we have to start wrapping up. So let me go ahead and start looking at the chat. Okay, so it's from Tari. It states, I'm a white cisgender pansexual woman with many trans and non-binary friends. I want to bring safe spaces to my campus. We have an LGBTQ plus ally group, but I believe the trans non-binary need their own space. How do I do that without being intrusive?
And I can start with that one. My thought, and again, it's one that I borrow from one of our classified professionals at RCC, who before we had a center was like, let's just rent space. And so if you do have a space, it might be something like, we're going to have an hour or two that's set aside for these folks to take up space, and putting a sign up and saying like, we're going to have a lounge or a happy hour or something like that, where trans and non-binary folks are welcome to come. There may be like a resource, something, right, to tie in, but it's not necessary to have a resource. I think just saying this is their space, right? Like we're making intentional time to show that we care, and they have a visible something, right? And I always feel like that's a good starting point. When I see somebody write on there that this is like QTPOC space, I'm always like, oh, that's great. Like, I want to see what that's all about, because that's me, right? And so that's, you know, for some folks, it's, I think, seeing. And then for me, in my experience, it's definitely students start doing some of that work. Like we've seen students who have really taken on, like, oh, we heard that you have this. And so we've started building, you know, they put together logos and they like drafted things by themselves, right? Even when I was at San Francisco State, students were like, well, we want to do this or we want to do that. So once they kind of, you know, you end up building momentum once you do something as simple as saying, this is the time, right? And hopefully like a college hour or something like that where it's accessible, right? Any other?
So somebody also shared a YouTube link in there about a TED Talk about chosen families, I believe. So folks can access that for later. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I'm looking at the time. Does anyone want to directly ask a question? Maybe raise a hand. That's also an option. I can keep a lookout here. Again, being mindful of time. Let's see. Adrian?
Sorry to interrupt. Hello, my name is Adrian. I am a student at OCC, Orange Coast Community College. And next semester, I'm planning on restarting the LGBTQ club at my campus that closed, unfortunately, due to COVID. And what is something that you guys would recommend me kind of including or like kind of being aware of, you know, when starting the club next semester?
Rob is the advisor of our student club. Rob, I don't know if you want to jump in.
So yeah, so every school is different. So the easiest way would be to see if you have, so at RCC, we have what's called the ASRCC, which oversees all of the clubs. And they could actually give you the information. Like, so at our school, it's like, okay, well, you have to have one full-time faculty who's willing to advise, and then X number of students sign up, right? So they could give you the information that you would need to get that started. I hope that helps. Because again, every school is different. So you would have to, the easiest way would be to, you know, to go, you know, to find out, you know, to go into the website or whatever, find the page that has all of the clubs, right? And then see if you can find sort of like an umbrella organization, or, you know, if you can't, right, go to one of the clubs and that, you know, like the you know, the advisor who's there already will know how to navigate that. And then you would just have to sort of do whatever your school wants. Does that help?
It does. Thank you so much.
Adrian, you might also want to look, I don't know if your school does this, but we have like ally training at our school. And when they complete it, they get a sticker and they put it on their door. So you can go to wherever like the faculty offices are and see who has that sticker, who has something rainbow or something like a trans flag or something that's showing that there's an ally in that space. Those are probably the doors I would knock on first, and kind of let them know what you're after. If they are not ready to advise, they might know other allies who are, or other people who are part of the community. We have an out and proud list at RCC, so everyone who feels comfortable outing themselves to the community or outing themselves as an ally, we have like a list of everyone's names and department. I don't know if your school has something like that. Might be a good place to start looking for an advisor and getting, you want someone who's going to be like there for fighting for you, you know, so having that advocate advisor is going to be really key, I think.
I'm not sure if we do have like a list on my campus, but I do know I know like my school's equity program has a lot of LGBTQ like workers and like faculty, which is we're kind of, I figure out like we're kind of got inspired, you know, to kind of restart the club and, you know, make sure that people at this campus, you know, are welcome no matter what the sexuality or gender identity is. So, yeah, thank you so much for all of your great advice.
Okay, so does anyone else want to ask a question? We have maybe about a minute or two. Okay, any final thoughts for the panelists? Okay, from the panelists, I mean. Okay, great. Well, thank you all. Thank you for thank you again for this presentation. It was really informative and super layered. I mean, it was very wonderful. I'm looking forward to revisiting the recording. So and take notes. But so again, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate the knowledge our presenters have shared and the time they have given to the summit today. As a reminder, session recordings will be posted in the app within 2 weeks after the conference, and the chat information will also be included. We ask that you complete the session survey listed at the bottom of the session in the conference app at this time. We hope you have a great rest of the day planned. We have a great rest of the day planned for you. And we will be moving to the next session. I believe there's a break coming up, and then and the links and for all the sessions and activities can be found in the conference app. Thank you for attending this session, and we will see you online soon. Thank you.